Hello everyone, this is Priscilla and Ethan and I will be discussing language variation, the sociological factors that influence language variation. So the main purpose is to show how language and society affect each other, and to do this we'll start by looking at what sociolinguistics is, how class, ethnicity, and gender can influence variation in language, and by looking at some situation-specific factors. Sociolinguistics is a study of the relationship between society and language. So language and the way we use language can reveal a lot about us, like where someone is from or what speech community they are part of. So basically, the different ways that we speak are influenced by things like who we grew up with, or where we live, or our culture, and other social factors. And then the way we feel about how we speak or how others sound to us are influenced by society. So sociolinguistics takes all of these factors to study how language forms part of our identity. And speech communities can vary in size. For instance, Boston is a speech community because members of that community share norms, like what they refer to as soft drinks, they call them tonics. But Boston is also part of a larger speech community since they are speakers of English. And they also share norms like how we put adjectives before nouns. And we can all pretty much understand each other no matter which dialect is being used, which is called mutual intelligibility and can be used to determine whether people are speaking the same language or not. But mutual intelligibility is not the only indicator that two languages are different. There are some exceptions to this rule. For instance, speakers of Swedish and Norwegian can understand each other but are considered different languages since they're spoken in different countries. So it does get a little bit more complicated because there are so many different features that indicates a person's speech. One of the features are called sociolinguistic markers, which the book defines as the visible linguistic features that have particular social meanings that speakers are somewhat aware of. So the book didn't really elaborate much on this, so I didn't really understand the difference. So I went and researched a bit and found that a marker is kind of like a stereotype. So a stereotype would be when a speaker knows that their speech community speaks a certain way, so they will intentionally make sure that they don't speak any other way. So for example, a person who uses standard American English will make sure they don't use the word ain't, like he ate my friend or they do be my friend. So they don't want to talk in a way that they view as broken English, which there is no variant of a language that is wrong. So there's no dialect of a language that is superior to another, even though some might be favored. So a marker is kind of like a stereotype, except speakers do not comment overtly on them. So an example would be if somebody says, I went fishing versus I went fishing. So the IN versus the ING. So speakers are aware that they speak this way, but there isn't a big difference among other speakers. So the other type of feature is called sociolinguistic indicators, and they are very subtle that people don't even notice them. Like the choice between using used to or would in a sentence. So like, he used to give me a ride to school or he would give me a ride to school. And the norms of a social community speech influence both markers and indicators. So when studying how language and society affect each other, there are several things that sociolinguists consider. So they consider social characteristics of the speaker, like region, gender, age, or class, the social relationship between participants, and the treatment of language by societies. Now I'm going to go over a little bit about how class influences variation, which is actually, it plays a large role. Class, or socioeconomic status, has played a large role in studying social linguistics since the beginning of the discipline. So what determines somebody's socioeconomic status? Social linguists have struggled with assigning what social class to assign their interviewers. There are so many things for them to consider, like income, amount of education, the type of house they have, or their job. Over time, though, linguists have seemed to just use occupational prestige as a main indicator of class. So language use and social class are closely related. We often listen to the way people speak or sign to determine which class they are in, like their pronunciation or which sociolect they use. It's a strong indicator that we use to judge someone else's class. That being said, people in a particular social class actually create a variation of their language that shows that they belong to that social class, which is called a sociolect. An example of this would be when French was the language of the aristocracy in Europe. So if you used French, then that was a pretty good indication that you were part of the aristocracy. And then another example today would be the use of English in India. So it's more likely that individuals in the higher social class speak English fluently. So on this slide, I want to show a video explaining a study done by William Lebeau, which showed a strong relationship between class and careful speech styles. In the 1960s, he studied the classic New York accent where the R is dropped after vowels. So they say New York instead of New York. He wanted to find what social factors influenced whether people said the R or not. You guys can go ahead and watch the video. It's only about 45 seconds long. I really liked it because it showed how closely related language use and social class are. And I thought it was really cool that Lebeau went to department stores instead of going to like a lab, where if he had interviewed people in a lab, they probably would have spoken in a more prestigious way instead of using the everyday speech that they use.
Instead of the lab, he went to a fancy department store, a mid-range department store, and a bargain department store. In each store, he picked a department on the 4th floor, say the shoe section. Lebeau then approached various salespeople and asked them where to get shoes, since both 4th and floor are words with an R after a vowel. He could listen closely to hear whether they said the R or not when they replied. The salesperson would either say 4th floor or 4th floor, and then Lebeau would say pardon, so the salesperson would repeat it more carefully. Lebeau would then head off, but instead of buying shoes, he'd pull out his notebook and write down whether the person used the R each time. He repeated this over and over at 3 department stores. And if you think that sounds a bit suspicious, you'd be right. Apparently he got questioned a few times. Whoops. At the end of the study, Lebeau found that the staff at the fanciest department store were most likely to pronounce the R, followed by the mid-range store, and finally the... Instead of the lab...
All right. Now we're getting into the second part of language variation, which is how ethnicity influences variation. Distinctions within a community, ethnicity. So if linguistic distinctions reflect a society's social distinctions, we find racial or ethnic differences in language. One of the greatest examples is African American English, AAE. There are mostly phonological and morphosyntactic features that distinguish African American English from standard American English. I'm going to go over some of these in the next slide, but one thing I wanted to mention right now is one study which compared one mainlander who was white and one islander who was black from South Carolina, and they studied the differences between their speech and their speech patterns. And they found that social differentiation in this small case was primarily based on morphosyntactic differences. And they boiled that down to basically ethnicity, geographical location, and basically the interactions they have with the people who live in their community. So that means that this is a more multifaceted part of language variation. So ethnicity could really boil down to more than just someone's ethnicity. It has more to do with the region, community, like collaboration among different people. These are some of the differences between African American English and standard American English. In the first picture, you can see morphosyntactic features. and it gives examples. So absence of the possessive S. So John hat or Byron car versus John's hat or Byron's car. The absence of a third person present S. So she talk, he sing versus she talks and he sings. I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. Absence of the S when quantifier is given. So 3 dog or some cat versus 3 dogs or some cats. Multiple negation. So he don't know nothing, negating twice. Inversion with indefinite negative subjects. Don't nobody talk like that. Basically, you can see there are a bunch of different morphosyntactic features. If you want, you could read the rest of them and look at the examples. And then at the bottom picture, it's comparing varieties of the English language. So it has standard, non-standard, Newfoundland English, African American English, and then the Caribbean Creoles. So I'll just read the first line. I've just eaten, I done ate, I'm after eaten, I done ate, I done eat. So basically you could tell each one of those has a different variation depending on the variety of English. And all of these are based in ethnic variations. Some other examples I wanted to give for African American English are some phonological variations. So they also reduce the cluster reduction of R. So instead of saying throw, they would sound like so. They also get rid of final consonant deletion. So in words like land, which end in D, they would drop the D and they land. Also the differences in ing endings. Instead of ing, they drop the final G. So one example would be singing versus singing. Another one is a substitution for T with the phonetic sound K within the word. So for the word street, they would say screet. And then unstressed syllable deletion. So for the first syllables unstressed in the word like about, they'll drop it for bout. So it's about, just bout. So those are some of the phonological changes in addition to the morphosyntactic features, and also these examples of varieties. All right, and then the next variation of language is how gender influences variation. Distinctions within a community, gender. So sociolinguists generally find differences in language used that reflect societally assigned gender roles. Women use more standard forms associated with official, overt prestige, while men use more non-standard forms. So one word is called covert prestige, a vocabulary word. And this is credibility that men aim for to prove their masculinity. So examples of this is a man focusing their own game or talking about going to the gym when they're around gym bros to try to prove to themselves or prove to the other people that they are masculine and they're conforming to these gender roles in language. Women use more of the incoming forms than men, meaning women use overt prestige forms and adopt changes from above due to linguistic insecurity. This means that women will change the type of language that they're using, and it'll have more influence on society and as language evolves, because women have a larger role in a child's development, and they also work more jobs associated with standard speech, such as teachers, like caregivers. So then they have more influence on a developing child and how they're gonna process language and use it themselves. There are also more distinctions in discourse, also characterizes gender language variation. In public mixed settings, case studies noted that men talked more, interrupted more, and controlled the topic more than women. Whereas in private one-on-one situations, women appeared to put in more work than men to keep conversations going. So that's one discourse that gender language variation has that is not as obvious, I would say, like not something you could go down to phonological or morphosyntactic changes. Another vocabulary word is the dominance approach, and these differences are reflections of men's dominance in society. This would mean that a lot of the language that we use today appears because we are a patriarchal society, and that the men have more control over how language is used in a society. And then there's also the differences approach, where girls tend to express affiliation, whereas boys express one-upmanship. And as people grow older, the theory is that boys will continue to use language that conforms to one-upmanship, while girls will tend to express more affiliation. And this also contributes to the dominance approach, because if boys experience more one-upmanship and they dominate more, then that will also lead to more male-dominated speech in society. And there's another concept called performativity. It's where individuals enact or perform their culturally shaped gender identity through various symbolic behaviors. So it would basically be a man being forced to talk more manly, or being pressured to talk more manly simply because he's a man. So man up, be a man, like act like a man, those kind of things. And also on the other side for femininity, complimenting a girl's hair or hairstyle, are also using like rhetoric that compliments and conforms to like typical beauty standards. So those are reinforced. What is the role of language on the formation of gender? One case study demonstrates that environmental pressure influences one's expressive tendencies. So that means the way someone will output themselves or demonstrate themselves to the outside world will be influenced by the pressure of society on it. So it really means that this is a multifaceted area of language variation. So it's more than just a gender difference. It lies more in what kind of cultural norms are being produced and supported in society, and that's going to influence the language. So it's not just masculinity versus femininity. It's really about how culture and how society puts itself forward and how it divides the line between gender, or where we even make arbitrary decisions like that. All right, and then the last area of language variation is how specific scenarios influence variation. One of the first one is occupation, and this could be like whether people work in plantation fields or not. This is like the example I got from the book. So the difference would be people working in the fields together would have a different kind of communication style, and that would be very specific to just the workplace. I think you can bring this to any kind of like work idea, because I used to work in like fast food places, and we always have like our own way of doing things. It can be different anywhere else, and you can't really copy that onto another place because it's so specific. So a specific scenario. Another one is performance register, and that's when speakers exaggerate distinctive features of their local dialect to reinforce their local identity. This would be like a Southerner who is really exaggerating their y'alls and stuff because they want people to know that they are a Southerner, they're from Texas or something. I'm not sure. And the last one would be a community of practice. And these are from people who engage in shared activities or likely develop shared language practices. So one study looked at the language use between jocks and burnouts inside the school, and they could tell that since each group of people had different interests or different activities that they shared, they each developed a different way of using language and practicing language and expressing themselves. So the jocks would obviously have a different communication style and like way to express themselves than the burnouts would. And that's based on just environmental, societal influences, such as just being in a school. Even though these people, both these groups of people are in the same environment, they have different output styles. All right. And this is our works cited. I thank you everybody for watching, and I appreciate it.